Hi, it's Brandon from Armory, and today we're going to be talking about various materials that could be used for armor. Specifically, we're going to be talking about low carbon steels, high carbon steels, stainless steels, and titanium. So, people have this misconception that titanium is the greatest kind of material ever out of these metals, and that's just not true. If you compare the highest quality steel to the highest quality titanium, steel will actually be stronger. And if you're looking for hardness for something, steel can actually achieve a greater hardness. So, what is titanium good for? Well, it's good for a strength to weight ratio. Um, that doesn't, however, mean that it's the best material for armor, at least not in the way that's typically done for armored combat that you see for medieval reenactment. So, let's say that you wanted to get a full suit of armor and you wanted it to be very, very protective, right? And so if you're using mild steel, you might want to get 14 gauge on the knees and elbows, 12 gauge on the head, and then everything else can be 16 gauge. And then if you had stainless steels, specifically you want a good strong industrial stainless. Cheap Chinese stainless like 440 is crap, don't use it. Um, but like SAE 304, which is used for architecture, like what I have here, very, very strong, you can get away with a step thinner than what I've described for mild steel. You can get something like 16 gauge on the knees and elbows and 18 gauge on everything else except for the head. The head I would suggest to keep it at 12 gauge and not go too much thinner. Um, and then the titanium option. So titanium you can similarly do what I've described for stainless steels and carbon steels, but it'll actually be lighter. If you compare mild steel to titanium, titanium is the same strength as mild steel at half the weight. And then titanium to very high quality spring tempered steels or high quality stainless steels, they'll be equivalent strength, and the titanium will be about 25% lighter, 20% lighter, somewhere in that range. But you don't want your armor to be too light. So the reason I'm talking about that is there's people that have had brigandines made out of titanium and they're like 20 gauge, right? Insanely light, 21 gauge, 23 is I think the thinnest I've ever heard of, but 20 gauge is what I hear a lot of. And what happens is when the titanium takes one hit too many times, it just cracks wide open because of how thin it is, and because you don't want that. That's why I'm saying like it's that risk. But not only does it have the risk of cracking open because it's hard but it's very thin, you also have this concern that with less inertia, more forces are going to be transferred to you, the target. So originally people had this misinformed idea that concussions are the damage of the brain is specifically that it's bouncing around inside your skull, but that's actually not why concussions are damaging. What's really happening isn't the swelling or bruising from the brain. What happens is, if you imagine my fingers are neurons, these neurons are ripping apart from each other. And so what you want to do is you want to prevent these kind of shearing forces from tearing apart the neurons in your brain. And you want to do that by having higher inertia. So a titanium helmet at 12 gauge would be horrifyingly bad, because if you got hit by a real halberd, like a big 8-9 foot poleaxe of something in that family of weapons, you don't have enough inertia to protect you. Your brain's probably going to just rip itself apart. Um, that's why 12 gauge steel is what most armored combat sports are starting to use. 14 gauge for something like SCA. I've even heard something as thick as 10 gauge being regulation for some groups, but yeah, 12 gauge is generally what you're going to want, and it's for that reason. Going further into the titanium versus steel discussion, so you also have to be mindful of not just what I mentioned about your helmet, but your organs too on your torso. If your kidneys take a nasty hit one too many times and your armor's very thin, like your kidneys are going to bleed internally. Kidney damage is a very serious concern. If you look up what happens to boxers when they get busted kidneys, it's horrifyingly painful for them. And similarly for anybody who gets a kind of injury there. So um, I would say you really don't want to have thin titanium armor there. If you absolutely feel you need to have that weight advantage, rather than going 20 gauge on the body, if you want to go 18 gauge on the body, that's fine, right? Similarly, I would actually recommend more than titanium spring tempered steels at 18 gauge for the body, maybe even 16 gauge. Personally, I fight with 16 gauge on my body. I just feel more safe and more comfortable with that. And then you'll also notice if you compare my knees and elbows to the rest of me that they're a bit thicker. The elbows are closer to 14 gauge. Um, but yeah, I would say rather than trying to get thinner armor to get that weight advantage, you probably want to keep it the same thickness as your mild steel and just be lighter than that at the same level of, or even greater protection, actually. Uh, there is another interesting caveat to be concerned about, though. So, obviously, armor that is thicker, heavier, has more inertia, has greater protective value. But something that we see in troops in real life for combat situations is the gear that they have that's incredibly heavy. That's putting a lot of stress on their knees, their elbows, their spines. And you have veterans coming back from combat, and even if they've never been hit by a bullet, they've never had an IED blow up on them, just the immense amount of stress on their knees and elbows and spines destroys them. They might need to get a wheelchair at some point, and that's a very real concern that you have for armored combat. You're wearing similar amounts of weight across your body and in your arms, and you don't want to fall apart because your armor's heavy, because that's counterproductive. At that point, you would have been better with a thinner armor, even if you got more impact injury from something hitting you. Uh, where exactly do you want to have this trade-off between I don't want my armor to be so heavy that it tears me apart, but I don't want it so thin that a single swing will just rip my arms off? I can't make that decision for you. And obviously, you should operate within the regulations of whatever armored combat organization you happen to be a part of, whether that's HMB, ACL, SCA, whatever. Um, but these are just concerns to have in mind. Um, if I had an unlimited budget and I could use any material I want, I would still use titanium, but I would do it very different from everyone else. I would probably want to get 7 or 8 gauge on my head, and then 14 gauge titanium on my knees and elbows, and then 16 everywhere else. And yeah, that would still be heavier than the spring tempered stuff that a lot of fighters are wearing because it's so much thicker than what they're wearing. And definitely heavier than what most people's titanium armor will be. But it'll still be insanely protective. Blades will have almost no conceivable chance of getting through 1,000 times in the same spot, not going to do anything. Hammers and maces are going to have a lot of trouble with something that thick. So yeah, that's what I would do in a hypothetical I have an unlimited budget situation. So some of you might then ask, well, why not just make armor that you've described? And my response is because titanium is incredibly hard to work. I would never want to be the one doing it. Um, Titanium, the way that the metal is when you compare it to like steel, especially low carbon steel, is that it doesn't want to move. It doesn't want to bend. No matter you heat it up so much, and unless you have like a pneumatic hammer, like a hammer press where it's just a mechanical piston coming up and down. If you're trying to do that with your bare hands instead and a hammer, the old-fashioned way, you're gonna hate yourself. You're gonna get torn apart, worn down, just making a helmet, and then the rest of your body is still unarmored, so you have to make that. It would be so much stress that I would say if you're trying to make it by hand, you probably would tear out your elbow if you try rushing it too much. It would be like a multi-year process to try and pull off what I've described. Unless you have a team, or again, like I was talking about, the mechanical machines that can just hammer stuff for you and shape the metal for you. Even then, it's still a lot. If you look at Baltimore Knife and Sword, I believe, they made a sword out of titanium. They ran through like a dozen sanding belts to sharpen one sword, just one. That's insane. And that's what you have to be worried about with titanium. If you shape it, you need to bevel it, you need to do anything to it. It's going to resist that so much every step of the way. That's why spring tempered steel is a much better choice, because before you quench, normalize, and temper it, normalize, quench, temper, that's the correct order, it's going to be soft, right? It's going to be pliable, easy to move, and it's normalizing that removes the internal stresses of you having reshaped that object. Like if I started with a round ball bearing of high carbon steel, made something else out of that, normalizing it reduces that internal stresses that I have from reshaping it. Then quenching it is what increases its hardness a lot, and then tempering it is what allows me to bend that piece of metal, and then it wants to spring back straight, or spring back to whatever shape it was when I had tempered it. So, yeah, these are just series of concerns I have for not just people who want to fight in armored combat sports of any kind, but also if you're a writer. I know a lot of people that are writing, whether you're writing books or you're writing a fan made character for some show or game or something, just be aware that these are concerns you're going to want to have. And I think approaching these subjects in your character and in your writing would actually be a very interesting thing. Seeing the thought processes of the character and the conclusions they come to for why they chose this material in this thickness for this body part as opposed to this other part. But yeah, these have just been my thoughts. And if you like what you heard and you want to hear more about historical arms and armor, just support us on Patreon or Raping the Armory. And have a good night.